The strategic patience is one of the things that the Russians are known for. Whether or not it's most effective form of military doctrine, it still seems to be a valuable asset that the Russians utilize. But that they're trying to leverage Prokrosk as a launch pad, a gateway, whatever, to the other cities in Prokrosk.
They don't actually need it. I mean, they can bypass it and then move on to Sloviansk and so on. They don't particularly need it as such. And actually, the next stage is quite difficult for them because there's a lot of open fields, and that's where they lose most of their people, especially in winter where you don't have cover. So it's not straightforward for the Russians to move on. I don't think it's patience. I just think they found it very difficult to achieve their objectives. And the problem is that Putin has stood up, as Gerasimov has stood up and said, this is, its fall is imminent, and it turns out it's not. And that's embarrassing. And that's why, about a third of Russian activity across the whole front is now devoted to Pokrovsk, because it's become a thing in itself, a strategic tendency which Clausewitz warned against.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to The Global Gambit, a podcast that looks at the intersection of international relations, geopolitics, and economic statecraft. Now, much of what we cover on this programme is the Russia-Ukraine war because of the magnitude and severity of it. We obviously cover other areas, but this time we are keeping to the Russia-Ukraine emphasis because of this new, groundbreaking, apparently, peace plan. Or is it the fourth or fifth? I'm losing track. If you hear slight sarcasm in my voice, it's because there is meant to be. I'm rather sceptical about the legitimacy of this new 28-point peace plan, but then I do know not much about it. Someone who does, though, is Sir Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor at the War Studies Department of King's College, and all round, I think, one of the most influential names in strategy and military history, well, around the world, I think. But Lawrence, you've been on the programme before. It's lovely to have you back. Garbled my introduction there a little bit. Quite simply to start off, you wrote a very, I think, pleasant but blunt assessment of the 28 points. Why are we bothering with this? Why is the mainstream media giving so much attention to this when it's just a rehash of the same ones with Putin's same maximalist demands?
Well, it's not quite that. So I think we've got to sort of try to work out the provenance of this. But from what I can work out, we became aware of this not because of an announcement from Trump or a statement from Rubio, but by a leak in Axios, which was then picked up by a variety of other newspapers. The leak appears to have come from Kirill Dmitriev, who's the Russian part of this action. Now, he was sent by Putin to Washington, to the US, where he's not sanctioned, and he's got American degrees and so on. But he basically runs the Russian sovereign fund. So he was there to show the value of economic deals. He's not a diplomat as such. Mm-hmm. But he has access to Witkoff, who's also not a diplomat as such. Neither of them have got much background in all of this. And they began to draft, or have drafted, a plan which a variety of others in the Trump administration are at least aware of and may have contributed to. But the critical points about it is it was neither discussed with Ukraine nor Russia. And although it's commonly presented, and for good reason, as pro-Russian, it gives Russia quite a bit of what it wants, it doesn't quite do so in the way that Russia would like. And that, I think, is one reason why the whole thing may fail. Overnight, we had the actual details of the plan released. So my view yesterday was this wasn't going to go anywhere because nobody apart from Dmitriev and Witkoff seemed to be aware of it. And status was uncertain. So now it has slightly more status, I think, because of the way the leak succeeded. People now have something that they have to address, and they have to take, and they feel they should take it seriously. And there are reports that Trump sort of wishes Zelensky to pick it up. The problem is it's incredibly amateurish. I mean, it's not drafted by anybody who really knows international relations. It's got all sorts of funny wording, promised to do things that don't need doing. It's clearly not had any lawyers, international lawyers involved. It's a mess. It's described as a dog's breakfast. So the problem with it is because it comes from Trump, he now seems to be encouraging it to be taken seriously. You can't just dismiss it. So Zelensky says, we'll take this terribly seriously, which is what he always says. And the Russians seem a bit nonplussed. I mean, they're not quite sure what to make of this. So I think the next few days will be interesting. The Ukrainians have got to push back on quite a bit of this because, I mean, Zelensky was in political trouble anyway. It would be even more political trouble if he accepted that as part of the sort of mythology of the sort of the Witkoff camp, that because Zelensky has been weakened by all the corruption allegations, which are very serious and are doing him harm, he would be strengthened by accepting a pro-Russian peace plan. In fact, the opposite is the case. So, I mean, Zelensky has to take it seriously, but he can't accept it. If the Russians had any sense, they'd say, yes, it's wonderful, but then zoom in on particular details, because some of it won't suit them at all. And a lot of it is just very unclear how it would work in practice, because it hasn't, it's 28 headlines. But this isn't, I mean, even with Gaza, which is sort of modelled, even with Gaza, that there was you had all the regional countries behind it, and Hamas in a very weakened position, and Israel utterly dependent upon the US at this point. And even then, we've had troubles with how it's been interpreted and implemented. It's not that far down. We've only just got a Security Council resolution on Gaza.
If I can just interject there, though, Lawrence, because, okay, so I agree with you. I obviously have my slight energized, excited initial outreach because it's to sort of, well, because it is the fourth or fifth time that we've seen something of this style. But if you look at the details, yes, you're right. What stood out to me, just as a couple of arbitrary examples, is one, that Ukraine is allowed to have, is it in the range of 500,000 to 600,000 troops instead of 80,000, but also that the Russians accept that they do join the EU eventually, not NATO, but the EU, which would still be it's more comprehensive, it's economic bloc instead of military alliance. So is it those sorts of details that maybe give this one a little bit more significance or something in your mind?
Well, the reason it's significant is it's the first time we've had a draft plan that doesn't come from either the Russians or Ukrainians that tries to address the range of issues that would have to be addressed in any peace plan. I mean, that's what. Now, I don't think it doesn't do it very well, but that's what it does. So that's the first significance. So it gives you a chance when you look at it, say, no, that won't work, this will work, and so on. Secondly, there's a lot of arbitrary language in there. So let's take the EU is not an issue. The Russians have sort of conceded that in the past. I mean, it's bizarre in some ways because this whole wretched business began with Putin trying to stop Ukraine signing an association agreement. And if he'd just let Ukraine sign an association agreement in 2013, Ukraine would still not be a member of the EU. But you wouldn't have had Crimea, the Donbass, and all the terrible things that have happened since. Anyway, that's by the by. That's not a big issue. The troop numbers is. So on the one hand, it irritates Ukraine because why should they have limits on their troop numbers? On the other hand, if there isn't actually a war, 600,000 is probably fine. And what it doesn't do is, and last time this issue was addressed in Istanbul in April 22, then it was 85,000 was the number. Well, that should be patently ridiculous now. But nor does it put limits on Ukrainian jets, tanks, HIMARS, or whatever. It doesn't put any limit as it stands. Now, I think, to be honest, in current circumstances with development of military technology, that'd be pretty pointless anyway. But I think that's one thing that will irritate the Russians. There's two things that strike me. The first is they talk about de facto Russian control of the Donbass and the bits of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia that they already hold. Now, I think the Russians could possibly just accept a ceasefire with Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, and then in effect what they've got is de facto. But that's not what they want in the Donbass. They've annexed it. Well, they've annexed Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, but they haven't got it, and the Donbass is clearly their high priority. So what is it with de facto? And they say the US will recognise de facto, and this is not just gibberish, because the point about de facto is it's a reality that you have to accept, but you don't want to give legal status to. As soon as you say this is Russian, then you've given it legal status. So it doesn't make any sense. And then they say that the bit of the Donbass, bit of Donetsk, essentially, which is a good chunk, over 20%, that isn't controlled by the Russians, will be handed over to the Russians, but it will then become a demilitarized neutral zone. Now, if you've been following this, the last thing that this part of the Donbass is demilitarized. It's just full of stuff, minefields and dragon's teeth and all sorts of obstacles for any further Russian advantage. And also people live there. It hasn't been evacuated. So how does that work? And again, I just don't see the Russians accepting that. So I think, for a lot of the commentators, including me, you look at this and say, gosh, it gives Putin an awful lot. But the problem for Putin is he's asked for more. And without a truly settled status for the Donbass, he's not going to be happy. Elsewhere, it says that, the Ukrainians will accept this and it'll be a violation of the agreement if they don't. And that's sort of understood, but it's still not wholly clear. Now, then you get to the security guarantees point. And it doesn't wholly preclude the sort of stuff that was being discussed by the quote unquote coalition of the willing, but it doesn't allow any European forces within Ukraine, which is actually problematic because even if, how does an advisory mission fit in on this, or a bit of training? But it does allow for air support in Poland, which was part of the plan. So, okay, you could establish a no-fly zone, and that, if the Russians decided to break the agreement, that would come to play. But more dramatically, it has a clause which has the United States sort of inflicting, organizing, coordinating, decisive force, I think is the phrase. Mm-hmm. Now, that's stronger than Article 5, actually, because Article 5 just requires you to treat an attack on one as an attack on all, and then think about what you do about it. This actually is a commitment to quite strong action. It's by the United States, but it can only be done with NATO. But NATO's not mentioned in this. And Russia and Ukraine isn't allowed to be part of NATO. But again, I think the Russians would just say, well, this is NATO by other means. Now, if you're a Ukrainian, you look at it completely different light. You say, how could I trust that this is nonsense? And so if you're a Russian, you think it gives Ukraine too much. So this is why, what we're seeing can't be implemented in its current form.
No.
It requires so much interpretation and clarification that you've got an endless negotiation, in which case you haven't got a ceasefire and the war goes on.
Well, that's why in previous conversations we've had, or other guests I've engaged with, one of the main, I think, well, it's all speculation, but sort of forecast we like to imagine scenarios is Ukraine effectively created as a DMZ, a demilitarized zone? Some people put it along the Dnieper River, some people put it along the current line of contact, some people say it's based on the natural borders of the oblasts, or the other version is a frozen conflict, right? All of this is, I think, rather pointless because it doesn't, as you say, resolve the structural and inherent differences between the two sides.
Yeah.
How can any of this be feasibly implemented if it's as arbitrarily written like this?
Well, I think there'd be real problems. There's no serious mechanisms for implementation, for dispute resolution, and so on. The President Trump puts himself in charge of a council of peace over which he will chair, which is just taken from Gaza and hasn't worked desperately well there. So I think what you've got is something which, if you could turn it into a proper trilateral negotiation with the US there and Ukraine and Russia, or you could work on it from both sides with more clarification. What does this mean? How would that work in practice? Then you could turn it into something. But it's not a great place to start because, there's some provisions that are just bizarre. There's a clause that says that Ukraine will not fire missiles at Moscow or St. Petersburg. That's all it says. And that would be a violation of the agreement. Well, does that mean you can hit Rostov?
Pretty Ekaterinburg's under this.
It's just strange. An early clause has, it's expected that Russia won't invade any of its neighbours, but Ukraine absolutely won't join NATO.
I have nothing to say about that.
Why do you say it's expected? Why don't you say they won't? It's just terribly drafted.
But what do we expect from Witkoff?
Well, I enjoyed yesterday my post noting his nickname. One widespread nickname is Dim Philby.
Okay, one last
famous double agent.
Wow. All right. One last question on this aspect, which is that obviously Bloomberg has reported in, I don't know, the past couple of hours that, Ukraine and Europe have rejected this, unsurprisingly. But let's say that this happens, right? And what's this going to do? This is going to piss off Trump. It's going to alienate him, and he's going to do his flip-flopping and go back to being like, oh, I'm more pro-team Russia again. At this point, shouldn't the Europeans just be really picking up the slack to, in a hypothetical again, just take over whatever the Americans currently provide in terms of security assurances? Is Europe in the capacity to replace the sort of the shortcut?
It's difficult because some things they still need. I mean, you still need to want to work with the Americans if you can. I think they're still going to. I mean, even if you want to put in an assurance force into Ukraine, you still need American help to do quite a lot of this. I mean, Europe is just not in as good a place as it should be. It's better than it was, but not in as good a place as it should be. So I don't think they want to break with the Americans. What I think they should do is at least think about the diplomatic role that the Europeans should play. I mean, fine. I mean, I'm highly critical of this process, as you can gather, but the Europeans have put in one of their own.
No,
Now,
that is fair.
The Russians don't want to deal with the Europeans. They want to deal with the Americans because they think the Americans will be more sympathetic. But there's no way that you can carry on like this. So there's a risk. I mean, there's a risk for the Ukrainians. The last I saw was that Zelensky was talking about. It's very interesting, and we'll talk about it next week. I haven't seen a firm rejection, but the reaction from Ukraine as a whole is very negative. So there's no way that Zelensky can say, "Oh, this is great," consider us signed up. He just couldn't do that. So that's maybe what they're getting, and Trump is going to have to make up his mind. But he hasn't got anything from Russia. I don't think the Russians actually would like this proposal in many respects. For example, there's a whole clause on the seized Russian assets, which sort of divvies them up in a very extremely complicated way, but it doesn't actually get them back to Russia, which is what the Russians would demand. The guarantees on the end of sanctions are pretty feeble, actually, which is one of the things the Russians would want. So I don't think the Russians could. I mean, as always with these things, my preference is to wait till the other side rejects and just play for time. But anybody with any sense knows that this is not a serious proposal as it stands.
Okay. Meanwhile, as this has been happening, the Russians have been mucking around in the North Sea, in and around British waters, with a ship known as Yantai. I made a video on it just the other day. What's your thoughts there? What is this laser things that they've been using? How much of a escalation or provocation is this, considering what they've been doing around the Baltics, around Poland, etc.?
I think they're taking more risks. They're becoming a bit bolder, and that's something that should worry NATO. The Polish business is really quite serious. This is actual sabotage, and there've been other elements of sabotage, but this is quite serious. So we're on the edge at the moment, I think, with a lot of this. Nobody's got killed as yet, and each can be sort of talked of as a particular incident. But it becomes, one of these things where incrementally over time it becomes a big deal, even if each incident is pretty small in itself. And I think there's a danger at some point one of these escapades will get out of hand and somebody will die. Or there'll be really significant damage and inconvenience and so on. So I think it's the Russians probing, being a bit menacing, trying to tell the Europeans about things they must and mustn't do. I don't think it has an awful lot of effect in that sense. I don't think it has a particularly coercive effect, but it is irritating and it can cost resource. So I think there's a big debate developing in the alliance, which, listening to Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister, who was pretty angry about what the Russians are up to. People are going to start looking for ways of, all right, you can do this to us, we can do things to you. And then once you get into that situation, the risks grow. Now, I think the best thing to do is to step up support even more for Ukraine. Or you can look, say, for joint air defence activities with Ukraine, which has been mooted because of the drone incursions and so on. So I think at the moment it's meant to stay within, quotes unquote, the grey zone, but there's a risk with it. because somebody just has to try something. I mean, the laser being used wasn't desperately powerful and so on. It was irritating. But there are more powerful lasers around. Let's say in the end, an RAF flight was brought down. What then happens? So I think it's becoming a more dangerous game and concerning for that matter. And the Russians sort of do stuff because they can do them. They don't necessarily have a clear plan as to why they're doing them. They just do them. And I think this is dangerous.
But as some people have said, political figures, individuals of influence, some people say that we're effectively at war with Russia at this point. Do you agree with that?
Not quite. I mean, the Russians say they're at war with us. And then it's a question of what do you mean by war? I mean, we're not in a full shooting war with the Russians. We still have diplomatic relations with the Russians. And I don't think the Russians want to be at war with us. We particularly want to be at war with the Russians. But we're certainly in a zone of activity that is not far short of it in some aspects. As soon as that's why I stress the importance of the threshold of violence, which leads to people getting killed or seriously wounded. I think once that starts happening, again, you may not quite be in a war, but you're a bit closer. We're edging, and I don't think there's a clear plan. I mean, what are we at war about? We know we wish to support Ukraine in its independence and fight for freedom and against aggression and occupation. The Russians don't want us to do that support. But what else do they want? What's this all about? Why is it just about our support for Ukraine? So it's very weird activity at the moment. And as I say, I think it's dangerous. And I think it doesn't do any harm for us, if we don't want to think ourselves at war, to at least think ourselves as engaged in a situation where we need to show a bit of urgency in building up our capabilities, preparing for even more difficult contingencies, showing that we're preparing for more difficult contingencies, thinking more about what we can do to the Russians than worrying all the time about what the Russians can do to us. All of those things. But we also have to be careful, because I think there's a balance, I call it the balance between panic and complacency. You don't want to sound as if you think this is all a nothing burger. It does matter. You've got to take it seriously, but nor should you sound like people should be fleeing the country or getting into their bomb shelters. I think that we're in a very in my lifetime, I think one of at least the most difficult, dangerous situation since Berlin in '61. I mean, I think it's that serious, but the incentives against a full-scale war on both sides are still pretty strong.
Yeah, but in that case, then, how much again should Europe be taking up a more proactive role via NATO, right? Of course, US commands the supreme control, but if they can't be dependent upon, what should the Europeans be doing?
I think the Europeans should do more of what they're doing. I mean, the Europeans are increasing the spending. I mean, Germany's going up really quite fast at the moment.
But when will this have an impact? When will we see this having
Well,
a tangible
I mean, they do
impact?
have it. I mean, it's better than it was. The stuff going to Ukraine that wasn't going before, it's been slow, but it is happening. So it's not as if there's nothing going on, but it needs to be more. You're not going to easily supplant the US. And for the UK, it's an even bigger problem, because we're so entangled with the Americans in most aspects of our security apparatus, including intelligence, that you just can't break with the Americans. So we'll see how that develops. I think the Europeans need to be more assertive. They need to be doing more, and I think they need to how the diplomacy could develop. Because at some point, both sides need this war to end, and you need to think how that can be achieved. And the problem that we've got with this latest proposal is that it just gives too much to Russia. But this requires Ukraine to be strengthened over the coming months, because if it isn't strengthened, then the Russians will increasingly think they can get a lot of it anyway. And that's what I've argued very strongly for a long time, that we concede too much in our minds to the Russians, that we assume that they're bound to win and that they're making more progress than they are, when actually their progress is glacial. But you always face the worry of the sort of gradually but suddenly problem, that morale at some point collapses at the front line. If they feel they're not getting more HIMARS, more artillery, they're doing pretty well at the moment. But it's a strain. When you talk to Ukrainians, they're weary. They don't get any sleep. They're cold. Now, none of this leads them to give up, but the pressures are on. So the best way to respond to all of this is to do our best to ease those pressures.
Okay. I love the word glacial, but okay, just on the boat off Britain, why are we not doing anything? Why not impound the boat at the very least, inspect it, or as some people have been saying, just sink it?
Well,
It's in British waters.
Well, if it wasn't in territorial waters. Take it, yeah, take it. I would seize it personally if you could, and inspect it.
Why are we not doing that? If it's been here in January, November, now it's here again in November. Like, why not?
Politicians get windy about things like this, and they're worried as to where it would lead. But I think the French have been a bit more aggressive recently, and with some of the Ghost Fleet. I personally think you should be prepared to do it. Once you start doing this, it is an escalation, perfectly reasonable one, but you've got to be prepared to defend it, and then you're going to worry about how the Russians respond. But if you keep on worrying about the Russian response, you'll never do anything.
All of this leads me to the final segment, which is on Prokrosk. Yeah. Obviously, we've got a lot going on with everything else now, diplomacy, but also provocations outside of the front. What is your take about the status of Prokrosk right now? Is it about to collapse, or is the media getting in a frenzy because it's, we're seeing the Russians with the momentum, quote unquote? How do you look at it?
So I think it's it's clearly a very difficult situation. The Russians have been trying to get Prokrosk for well over 15 months now. They've lost tens of thousands of lives in the process. It no longer has strategic importance to Russia because the main value of Prokrosk to Ukraine was the logistics as a logistics hub, and it can't serve in that role anymore because of drones. So it would have been perfectly feasible for the Russians to ignore Prokrosk completely now and just get on to the next targets. But because Putin has endowed it with such significance, and this is what the point that Zelensky and other Ukrainians have made, it's very hard to let it go when Putin keeps on claiming it's about to fall. And it's sort of good to show he's wrong. I mean, I'm always very careful when I'm not on the front line. I read what I can read, and you get quite contradictory reports. As far as one can work out, the Russian position on the south of the city is very strong now. Pretty strong, but not so much on the north. The Ukrainians have got a corridor that allows them to move in and, if necessary, move out. And if there's any risk that corridor was closed, they'd have to get out before it was closed. And what you don't want is to be enveloped inside the city. But battles at the front now are not, with huge numbers of troops. The Russians had 200. Now they say they've got 500. It's been said that they've got 500 inside the city itself. This is not massive numbers, and Ukraine's got a number, and they're shooting up the Russians as they find them, and so on. So what you get, I think, from Ukrainians at the moment is it's very difficult, a very tough battle. It's sort of they're not losing it dramatically, but at some point it could get too difficult. So my guess is that while they can, they'll keep on going and just try to hold the Russians down and see if the weather conditions and so on give them opportunities to really make it hard for the Russians to stay. Because it's odd that they haven't just concentrated on encirclement and have put troops inside the city. But at some point, it wouldn't surprise me if they evacuated, because in the end, you've got to work out where are your troops most useful. And at some point, the answer may not be Pokrovsk. At the moment, the propaganda advantage and also the attritional advantage is quite high. So you can see why they want to stay for the moment. But the danger in these circumstances, and people always go back to Bakhmut, is you just stay too long.
Well, that was going to be my point.
You lose some of your best people.
But that was my point, or going to be my countenance, which is the strategic patience is one of the things that the Russians are known for. Whether or not it's most effective form of military doctrine, it still seems to be a valuable asset that the Russians utilize. But that they're trying to leverage Prokrosk as a launch pad, a gateway, whatever, to the other cities in Prokrosk.
My point
in
was,
the Oblast, sorry.
yeah, but my point was that they don't actually need it. I mean, they can bypass it and then move on to Sloviansk and so on. They don't particularly need it as such. And actually, the next stage is quite difficult for them because there's a lot of open fields, and that's where they lose most of their people, especially in winter where you don't have cover. So it's not straightforward for the Russians to move on. I don't think it's patience. I just think they found it very difficult to achieve their objectives. And if they, and the problem is that Putin has stood up, as Gerasimov has stood up and said, this is, its fall is imminent. And it turns out it's not. And that's embarrassing. And that's why, about a third of Russian activity across the whole front is now devoted to Pokrovsk.
Mm.
Because it's become a thing in itself, a strategic tendency which Clausewitz warned against, because it becomes almost a distraction. You're not using your forces most effectively. The question for Ukraine is how far do they go in just thwarting the Russians, recognizing a point will come when they may not be able to thwart them much longer, when there may be better things they can do with troops when troops are in short supply.
Well, I was going to ask you, that was my follow-up, which was going to be, of all this, obviously, an emphasis, other military analysts like Michael Kaufman, Rob Lee, emphasize manpower. No matter how much you have technical offset or the role of drones and the shift away from heavy artillery equipment or whatever, manpower is still irreplaceable. Is that something that the Ukrainians do have a systemic disadvantage to still, this law where they're allowing younger people to leave the country now, and we've seen droves of youngsters leaving Ukraine because of this? What are these decisions revealing about the decision making behind Ukraine's military?
It's tough. I mean, I think the problem is they should have mobilized people in 22. Should have mobilized more people in 22. But then, young Ukrainians volunteering in numbers. The problem is the front has been a pretty grim place to be, and they've lost confidence in some, not all, of their commanders. Some of the better. The thing about Ukrainian armed forces is it's not really that homogenous. There's a lot of very distinctive battalions and so on with their own history and culture and organisation. Some of them very well led. Some of them they have no trouble recruiting and have their own drone supply. It's quite fragmented in some ways. So the Ukrainians are moving to a more contract system, which is not that similar to the Russians, to try to just get people to sign up and give them a decent financial return. And then basically they try to develop tactics that are not reliant on infantry or less reliant on infantry. And they fought for a long time in Prokrosk on that basis. So you don't actually, whereas in Bakhmut, you had lines manned by troops who then got battered by glide bombs and so on. Now you have very thin lines, very, very thin lines, which are sometimes too thin. The Russians get through by means of infiltration with very small groups. And the Ukrainians at the front, their main job is to spot Russians and tell the people at the back that they're coming. And the use of drones is a way of compensating. The problem they've got is that the advantage they had in drone warfare it's just not there anymore. I mean, the Russians have come up with substantially, not only with scale you would expect, but in some quality as well. So that I think is why the Ukrainians have got difficulty. I don't think it's difficult. I don't think it's desperate. One of the problems is they do have reserve forces, that sort of special forces that went into Pokrovsk, but you can only do that so often, not so much of it. So it is pretty spread, and they've got to work out where they prioritize. But so do the Russians. I mean, the Russians are quite thinly spread at some points now because they've devoted so much to Donetsk.
All right. I guess the last question I have for you is forward thinking. This is going to be a tough winter for both sides. Russia is struggling internally, something I cover and follow a fair amount. It's not looking great economically, but neither is it for Ukraine, given the reasons that we've sort of touched upon.
Yeah.
If you were to emphasize a few takeaways for viewers, listeners, what would they be? What are you going to be focusing on?
So I think obviously we've got to see how all this diplomacy plays out, and that just depends on a number of people playing a game which we're now quite familiar with. Leaving that aside, I think you've got first the ability to survive the winter. It's tough, really tough for Ukrainians. It's cold, don't have electricity for a lot of the time. gas has been affected, though. LNG is coming in and so on. I mean, the Ukrainians seem to think they'll cope, and you have to hope they will, but it is tough. But once you get to February, March, then whatever coercive effect came from the Russian attacks on critical infrastructure starts to be eased. And plus the question of how well they can hold the front. It's likely Prokrosk will go, certainly highly possible, but it's not definite. But assume, is that it? Or, I mean, in other places, the Ukrainians have been pushing back, Kupiansk, for example. So what the front looks like in a couple of months will also be important. If it hasn't changed very much, I think that adds to the pressure on Russia. Then you've got the issue of the Russian economy, the Ukrainian attacks on oil infrastructure, refineries. There was spare capacity in refineries. So Ukraine could take out 20% or more of capacity, but that doesn't actually cut the output by 20% because they weren't working at full capacity before. But it's causing them problems. And if this stuff keeps on, and if every time they repair something, it gets hit again, that gets hard too. So I think the Russian economy is a problem for Putin. I don't think it's a cliff edge, but it's a problem. So my view is, I don't think there's a certain way of ending this war or bringing it to a conclusion. It does depend on a Russian decision in the end, because Ukraine has got no choice, I don't think. The Russians have got to, at some point, see this as futile. This is just pouring resource into a purposeless war, because it's not a war they can seriously win in the end, whatever they think they've achieved when a ceasefire comes. So I'm not optimistic about a quick end. I think it would require big shift from the Russians, and I don't see it, nor do I have great insight into Kremlin decision-making.
Well, if anyone does.
Yeah, if anybody does. I mean, it's just very difficult.
No, I appreciate that, Lawrence. It's a stark reminder. I think instead of uncomfortable truths, I've seen the state budget for Russia in the next 3 years, and they're meant to be spending about $200 billion equivalent, 210 each year, which is obviously more than 40% of the overall budget, or nearly 40%. So that shows you, and none of this
8 to 9% of GDP.
Yeah,
I mean, and their projections have been optimistic in terms of the economy in recent years. So I think they'll struggle. I mean,
well, it's also because there's no
hard choices to make, because the civilian sector is suffering enormously now in Russia.
Yeah, colleagues, friends of mine who still live there, they tell me like all the public infrastructure you'd expect of a government, public goods, education, healthcare, transport, telecommunications, all being cut, but taxes are going up.
And taxes are going up.
And also, obviously, all this money spent on the war economy doesn't trickle back into the economy and
Absolutely
supply side
useless
stuff. So longer term costs there. But we'll just have to have you back in early 2026.
Okay.
Delightful to have you back on, everyone. If you enjoyed the conversation, do check out Lawrence's Substack and
comment is freed.
Yeah, it's freed. I love it. It's so clever. I only came up with a crappy name like the Global Gambit, but anyway, no, it's been a pleasure. Everyone, thanks for watching. Give the video a like, subscribe, share, and we'll see you all next time. Take care.
All the best.
Thanks, Lawrence.